This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, recorded at 13 hours GMT on Thursday, the 4th of September. I'm Mark Coles with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service news today. Coming up, huge challenges for NATO as its leaders meet in Wales.
A crucial summit at a crucial time. We are faced with a dramatically changed security environment.
And we'll look at whether the alliance is up to the new challenges it faces across the world. Also in the programme, Al-Qaeda says it's expanding into South Asia. But is this a serious threat? Our reporter finds out how lorry drivers at one French port are taking on an unwanted cargo, illegal migrants who are desperate to reach Britain.
See, when I stop at these lights now, I guarantee I'm going to have 4 or 5 of them in the trailer here now.
OK, so here's a traffic light. Let's see what happens. We've just passed about 6 guys. Yep, they're running. You can see them in the mirror running towards the back of the lorry.
Even I can see them getting in the trailer or trying to, but sometimes when it's dark here, you can't see them.
As a new report gives some disturbing figures on suicides across the globe, one mental health campaigner says governments must act to help those at risk.
Young people are especially at risk of taking their own lives. I think suicide is now the second leading cause of death around the world between 15 and 29-year-olds, which is really shocking.
And we visit the academy in Afghanistan that's training the next generation of army officers who will lead the fight against the Taliban. But first to the NATO summit in Wales, where an organisation which has been scrambling for relevance has found a new purpose as it faces huge new challenges in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa and on the wider global stage. Speaking before formal proceedings began, NATO's outgoing Secretary-General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, said the alliance's in-tray was bulging with dangerous dossiers, making this conference all the more timely.
A crucial summit at a crucial time. We are faced with a dramatically changed security environment. To the east, Russia is attacking Ukraine. To the southeast, we see the rise of a terrorist organization, the so-called Islamic State, that has committed horrific atrocities. To the south, we see violence, insecurity, instability. Here at the summit, we will take important steps to counter these threats and to strengthen the defense of our allies.
The president of one of those allies, Ukraine's Petro Poroshenko, has been meeting NATO leaders this morning as the Ukrainian leader pondered the latest peace proposal from Russia's President Vladimir Putin. The NATO Secretary-General made it clear that he was very sceptical about the Russian offer.
I think the bottom line is that the Russians are not sincerely interested in a ceasefire. They continue to destabilize eastern Ukraine. As regards NATO allies, actually I don't think there is an imminent threat towards any NATO ally because our determination is so strong, because our defense and deterrence are so strong, and the Russians know that if they were to cross that red line, we would respond determinedly.
Our diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus is at the NATO summit at Newport near the Welsh capital Cardiff. And just before we recorded our podcast, James Kumarasamy asked him for the latest on the talks.
A number of key NATO leaders met with President Poroshenko this morning. There's a much larger meeting of all the NATO countries with him later this afternoon. Clear and resolute support for Ukraine, for bringing it closer as a partner of the Atlantic Alliance. Clearly a very strong condemnation of Russia, but also confusingly, I think. On the one hand, you heard their great scepticism from the NATO Secretary-General about the peace proposals that have been doing the rounds over recent days. And now, really in the last very short few moments, an announcement apparently from the Ukrainian president that some kind of peace process will be signed in Minsk, possibly as early as tomorrow. So clearly a lot of scrabbling around here to try and find out what precisely is happening, but I think clearly if there were to be diplomatic steps towards a resolution, nobody would be more happy than NATO. Nobody wants to see this military confrontation continuing in eastern Ukraine.
I suppose the question is, what does President Putin want?
Well, absolutely. And we know that throughout this crisis, Russia's positions have been ambivalent, to say the least. He has made statements and announcements which appeared to defuse the situation at crucial moments, and that, I think, explains much of the NATO scepticism. As I say, we've seen elements of what apparently was a Russian peace plan. It seemed to be very strong on Ukrainian military pullbacks and so on. Didn't seem to say anything about Russian pullbacks. And of course, the Russians will not openly acknowledge that their armed forces are inside eastern Ukraine.
What about the other big issue on the table, the rise of Islamic State in Syria and Iraq? Do we have a unity of purpose in that as well from NATO leaders?
I think there is a unity of purpose, yes. Whether it's specifically NATO's job to deal with that, and whether indeed the main way of dealing with it should be through military means is less clear. I mean, obviously NATO has had a role in the past in training Iraq's armed forces. I think it's clear that if the Iraqi government asks for that again, NATO would give it serious consideration. But I think more this is going to be a multilateral effort by those countries who feel they have something to contribute and are willing to contribute. And I think that's one of the key things that will be happening at the dinner tonight, with President Obama in particular eager to sound out other NATO countries. Are they willing to join in American military action, for example, in Iraq, helping the Kurdish forces, helping the Iraqi military, perhaps joining in with airstrikes? And then the very big question, might such activity be extended to Syria too, where Islamic State is also heavily entrenched? Of course, there the concern is that by attacking Islamic State, they would, in some senses, be assisting the regime of President Assad, who clearly is not somebody that the Western countries or NATO wants to be seen to be backing.
Jonathan Marcus, the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, speaking there to James Kumarasamy just before we recorded this podcast. The Islamic State movement, or IS, has emerged very rapidly and seized huge swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq in recent months. It's also been responsible for the beheading of 2 American journalists in recent weeks. IS, though, is not the only radical Islamist group operating in the region. Jeremy Bowen is our Middle East editor, and on this morning's edition of Outside Source, my colleague Ros Atkins asked him to respond to questions by several of our listeners around the world to clarify just what the various movements want and how far they're connected. Firstly, a question from a listener in Britain on exactly how we should refer to the Islamic State as a group.
Funnily enough, I've just been discussing all of that with people here in the management at the BBC. The British government calls them ISIL. I don't know why they've chosen that formulation, perhaps because the Americans have used it. We always used to call them ISIS. Then they rebranded themselves IS for Islamic State. So we say Islamic State without the definite article, and we also say the group that calls itself the Islamic State or IS. I think, in a sense, if people call themselves something, you've got to reflect that, even if you don't like them.
Here's another question about the differences between the Islamic State, the al-Nusra Front, who are, we know, fighting near the Golan Heights in Syria and in other places at the moment, and al-Qaeda, a group we already know quite a lot about. How do we define those 3 groups?
Well, they all, if you like, share a common ancestor, which is al-Qaeda. IS started off as a splinter group to al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were bested for a while in Iraq and then went and relaunched themselves in Syria in the vacuum that opened up there, and basing themselves on that new strength went back into Iraq. So they've been around for a while in different guises with different acronyms attached to their names in the English version anyway. And the Nusra Front are a group of people who share a lot of those same jihadi beliefs, but they ally themselves with al-Qaeda. Now, IS is a tangible force holding territory. Al-Qaeda is an ideology, really, these days. It's a brand. And that's something, then, which the Nusra people look to. And Nusra and IS, at times, have fought each other.
Here's a very interesting question from Farzin, who says he's an Azerbaijani American born in Iran, and he says both Russia and China have their own Islamist insurgencies which they have to deal with. What might it take for those 2 countries to take a keener interest in the Islamic State and what it's doing in Syria and Iraq?
Well, Chinese foreign policy tends to be more about commercial issues, and they don't pretty much get involved in more of a military sense abroad. Not even politically all that much sometimes. It's more about doing business. The Russians are already intimately involved with what's going on because, of course, they are, with Iran, the main backers of President Assad of Syria. So the Russians already have a very big dog in this fight, and it's a question of the degree to which Assad sees ISIS as, in a weird way, a strategic asset because they at times fight other anti-Assad militias. It's quite complicated. And it's a question of the degree to which he then wants to have a go at ISIS himself, because up to now, ISIS haven't really targeted themselves at the Syrian regime very much. They've concentrated more on holding that ground in northern Syria, which is something which the different rebel groups have been at times fighting over.
And here's a question from Peter, who's a journalist in the UK. Ask a question actually I've been wanting to ask you for a while, which is, to what degree does the Gaza conflict impact on what's happening in Syria, if at all?
I think among people who have a mindset which says that the West is up to no good, that they're out to get Muslims, then I think that that's often seen as all part of, not the same particular issue, but it's all can be grouped under the same kind of umbrella. Right. So those people who see the guiding hand of the West behind things that go wrong in Muslim countries can easily conflate the two.
Just in the last minute, we often report that ISIS is a sophisticated media operation. I wonder if they approach media organisations like us. Do they try and communicate with you? Do they offer interviews to anyone?
They've never communicated with me, and I'm not even sure if they offered a trip in whether I'd really want to take it. But Vice News have got some good stuff out of ISIS. They've managed to have people travelling with them. It's something that we haven't achieved yet with the BBC.
That would take quite a risk assessment, I imagine.
Yeah, it would be a very
complicated thing.
It would be a very dodgy thing because I think Vice had a Palestinian guy, but wrongly, the BBC is sometimes seen as an arm of the British government or indeed of Western policy,
so it gets a bit
which
more
of course we know it's not.
Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's Middle East editor, speaking there to my colleague Ros Atkins. In recent times, Al-Qaeda has seen its prominence fall as IS has emerged. But today there was a reminder of Al-Qaeda's ability to grab the global headlines. It came in the form of a video message from the group's current leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, inviting Muslims from across South Asia to join what he called the caravan of jihad. So does this pose a genuine new threat, or is it an attempt to re-establish credibility? Jason Burke is a correspondent for The Guardian and The Observer newspapers in Britain and is author of Al-Qaeda, The True Story of Radical Islam. James Kumarasamy asked him what exactly the Al-Qaeda leader is calling for.
Well, he's announcing the foundation or the establishment of a new wing, if you like, of Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda in India specifically, although he's using the word Al-Hind, which indicates a broader area than the modern nation of India. It's basically part of a long-running effort, several years old now, to boost the profile of Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent, in South Asia, something that, as I say, al-Zawahiri has been trying to do for some time, but something that hasn't met with a great deal of success on the ground, as far as anyone can tell.
Is it likely to meet with any more success now?
I don't think so. There's no real evidence of any broad mobilisation, even any significant mobilisation among Indian Muslims, 150 million Indian Muslims, of whom a handful have become involved in violent extremism over recent decades. Very little indication that that's going to change whatever al-Zawahiri is calling for. In fact, it looks much more like this is a bit of positioning, a bit of marketing, if you like, for Al-Qaeda, a group that hasn't really been able to pull off any significant attacks in recent years, that has been marginalised by events in the Middle East, and particularly by the new challenger, if you like, for preeminence in the global jihadi movement, and that's the Islamic State over in Iraq and Syria.
So is this almost a plea for relevance?
It's certainly an attempt to stay in the mainstream. It looks a bit like Al-Qaeda are searching for new markets, a new area of expansion, somewhere where they can find recruits, donors, opportunities, profile, all the things they used to have but have been losing in the core countries that are interesting to them in the Middle East. They're looking elsewhere, they're looking in South Asia, they see that there are an awful lot of people out there who they see as potential recruits, potential radicals. They're almost certainly wrong, but it looks like an opportunity to them. They wouldn't be the first people globally to look at India, look at these big populous countries with significant problems like Pakistan or Bangladesh and think about expanding here. They would also not be the first to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of society's politics and religion here and very likely see their efforts wasted.
The British writer and journalist Jason Burke speaking to my colleague James Kumarasamy. You're listening to Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And if you'd like to comment on this podcast or indeed the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. You can also post a message on the BBC World Service Facebook page, facebook.com/BBC World Service. The authorities in the French port city of Calais are struggling to cope with an influx of migrants, most of whom are trying to cross the Channel to the UK. The mayor of Calais has said that unless the British government contributes more towards security costs, she will actually block the port. The BBC's Beth McLeod reports from Calais.
This is a diesel point where you get diesel for the lorries.
John Mitchell, a lorry driver from Ireland, eases his red truck from a filling station towards the port.
Look, see, that's them there now.
Oh, so already we've just left the diesel station and there's 4 migrants there.
It's gone so very bad. You know. See, when I stop at these lights now, I guarantee I'm going to have 4 or 5 of them in the trailer here now.
Okay, so here's a traffic light. Let's see what happens. We've just passed about 6 guys. Yep, they're running. You can see them in the mirror running towards the back of the lorry.
Even I can see them getting in the trailer or trying to, but sometimes when it's dark here, you can't see them.
Our brief stop at the traffic light had given one migrant enough time to stow away.
Do you hear that banging?
Do you think there's people on board?
I think so now, I don't know. I hear banging going on. I know now in 2 seconds when we open the doors.
Hi. Hi, do you speak English?
Speak Francais?
A young man, about 20 years old, emerges shyly from the trailer.
Where are you from?
Sudan.
You're from Sudan?
I hope to go England, but the way is very difficult. Why I can't do? I haven't no way. I haven't where to live.
So you're not angry with it? I think you're giving him a cigarette.
They're nice people, like so.
Yeah.
It's nice to be nice, isn't it?
And with that, he walks off, soon blending into a group of young men huddled by the side of the road.
Well, I've got to say, it feels a bit like a refugee camp down at the quayside in Calais. There's about 400, maybe 500 people, mostly men, queuing right round the corner. I can't even see the end of the line, actually, waiting for food to be dished out by a charity. They're serving up potatoes and fish and vegetables out of huge vats.
Halal, I'm from Pakistan, trying to go to England.
Why can't you stay here and claim asylum?
There is no work. They don't give any house, no benefits, nothing.
You think you'll get all those things in England?
No. But many people are working in England illegally or they're just getting their wages. Everything is fine there. But here, nothing.
The increasing number of migrants arriving in Calais has many locals feeling overwhelmed. Not least the mayor, Natasha Bouchard, who says the British government must do more to help.
Les conditions d'accueil du Royaume-Uni sont beaucoup plus favorables.
The UK is much more welcoming to migrants than other European countries. They think it's an Eldorado.
Un Eldorado pour eux.
You have spoken about blocking the port of Calais if the British government doesn't do more to help. Is that a serious threat?
Oui, elle est sérieuse.
Yes, it's a serious threat. For 12 years, the British government has ignored the suffering of the people of Calais. We want them to recognise they've put us in a very difficult position that we can no longer stand.
But it would be illegal to block the port.
Oui, eh bien, c'est peut-être illégal.
Yes, but it's also illegal not to be able to live in freedom in one's own country.
The Mayor of Calais, Natasha Bouchard, ending that report from Beth McLeod. Now, let's get up to date with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. More than 1,900 people have been confirmed dead, though some international agencies fear the true figure may be much higher. And governments across the region have been looking for ways to contain the virus. But what about the situation on the ground? John Moore is a photojournalist with Getty Images. He's just back from Monrovia in Liberia, one of the worst affected countries. This is what he saw.
Because of its transmission, family members who care for sick relatives are bearing the brunt of this epidemic, and also health workers as well. Anyone who's caring for sick or dying or dead people is at the highest risk of contamination. Doctors Without Borders, MSF, has been building and expanding a treatment center on the edge of Monrovia. It started with 120 beds, but they're expanding it to many hundreds more. The problem is they can't really build it fast enough to take care of the need. Ambulances come from all over the capital city area, dropping off patients at the front door, and MSF admits them as quickly as they can, but often you'll have people waiting outside on the gravel for their turn to get in. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, has set up a mobile testing lab right next to MSF. And they are trying to test blood samples from everyone who comes in so that they can keep people who do not have Ebola away from those who do. And they're trying. And let's see, time will tell how quickly this spreads.
And if you want to see more of John Moore's report from Liberia, his Twitter handle is jbmoore6400. Another of the countries affected is, of course, Nigeria. Our correspondent there in Lagos is Tomi Oladipo.
There is a lot of precaution going around, in Nigeria. When you go around town, you see a lot of people using hand sanitizers. When you enter certain institutions, they even have these thermometers to check people's temperatures. But in a place like Lagos, which is so densely populated, it's so difficult to screen everybody that comes your way. And at the same time, the other fear is that very population, that very density would make it easy for such a virus to spread. As we're seeing now, the Nigerian government thought it had contained the virus in Lagos, but now we're hearing of new cases that have spread beyond Lagos to Port Harcourt, which is another major city. So the main issue is that this is a fairly new health problem Nigeria is dealing with. So the health services are having to put up or just construct new mobile testing centers around the country where they can, deal with any suspected cases and have people isolated there. So it's the fact that this is new to the country and the country's already stretched or already challenged healthcare systems are having to now deal with something considered more urgent and more deadly than what Nigerian health services are used to.
Tomi Oladipo, the BBC's correspondent in Nigeria. And on the BBC News website, there's a special report on the Ebola outbreak with regular updates from the countries affected and background information. You can find that at www.bbc.co.uk/news/World Africa. The World Health Organization has just published its first ever report on suicide prevention, and the statistics are very shocking. Across the globe, someone ends their life every 40 seconds. That's around 800,000 people every year. But just 28 countries have any sort of strategy aimed at preventing suicide. And the WHO calls for governments, health services and even schools to give a far greater priority to suicide prevention. One British mental health campaigner, Johnny Benjamin, has direct personal experience of the anguish caused by suicidal depression, as he explained to my colleague Ros Atkins.
I began experiencing severe depression when I was 16, 17, and that's when I also started to have suicidal thoughts and feelings. Those carried on for a few years. And then when I was 20, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I went to go and take my life. I went to jump off a bridge, and I was stopped by a passerby that talked me out of what I was about to do. And then 6 years later, on from that, I launched a campaign to try and find him because I wanted to raise awareness of suicide. Mm-hmm. And within 2 weeks he was found, and a massive social media campaign.
I know, I'm sure this is ringing bells for people because it got a lot of coverage all around the world, didn't it?
It did. It was called the Find Mike campaign, although Mike wasn't his real name. But we called it the Find Mike campaign. It was massive on social media. And yeah, it was amazingly within 2 weeks he came forwards and we were reunited.
Well, thank goodness he was there for you when you needed him, but presumably you would like not just the UK government, but all governments to have a slightly more organised approach to helping people when they get to the point you reached.
No, absolutely. I mean, suicide prevention has never really been a priority for governments, it seems, which is just shocking, really, considering the statistics, which, you just said, every 40 seconds someone takes a life. And in this country alone, it's 16 people every day that take their lives. And that's double the amount of road fatalities. And yet there's so much in terms of, say, road safety. But when it comes to suicide prevention, there's just not that much out there.
But I want to understand, there are policies in place to help people with depression. Do you think you need something specific for people who go beyond depression into having suicidal thoughts? Is that a separate issue or is it one and the same?
No, I believe that's another issue on top of, looking after people with mental illness. I think there needs to be kind of much more public awareness around suicide and how to approach people that may be experiencing suicidal thoughts and feelings. Too few of us know how to react when they see someone who may be at risk of taking their lives or experiencing those thoughts and feelings. And I think there needs to be much more public awareness, much more education in schools as well, because as statistics today have shown, young people are especially at risk of taking their own lives. I think suicide is now the second leading cause of death around the world between 15 and 29-year-olds, which is really shocking.
And before I let you go, can I just ask about your experience of being someone who almost took their life but fortunately didn't? I was reading just yesterday about an American woman who runs a website for suicide survivors, and she was saying, and you're not allowed to mention this, you can't even mention it in mental health circles, it's this kind of thing which no one talks about. Have you been able to, obviously you're here now, but initially was it something that you were able to tell friends and family about?
Not initially, no, because there is this sort of embarrassment that there's this shame around, suicidal thoughts and feelings, attempting suicide. It's still a massive taboo, and obviously the death of Hollywood actor Robin Williams last month obviously kind of ignited a debate around suicide, but there's still this taboo, there's still a silence around suicide that we desperately need to break.
Mental health campaigner Johnny Benjamin speaking there to the BBC's Ros Atkins. And you can find out more about Johnny's remarkable story at this website, www.timetochange.org.uk. Now, earlier in the podcast, we mentioned the NATO summit in Wales, and one of the items on the agenda there is Afghanistan. NATO leaders will be asked to pay $5.5 billion a year for the Afghan armed forces. The country is currently in political paralysis because of a disputed election. But despite this, the armed forces are improving, partly through the work of an academy modelled on Sandhurst, the British Army Officers Training Centre. The BBC's David Loyne has been out on exercise as the first group of cadets finish their year of training.
An Afghan officer cadet talks patiently to a village elder where two neighbouring villages are in conflict. They're role-playing for now, but in just a few weeks this will be for real. And as a smoke bomb explodes, a stand-in for a suicide bomber, the cadets have to extract casualties under enemy fire. I go ahead of the cadets and find a group of senior British and Afghan officers watching the exercise on some high ground. Among them Lieutenant Colonel Sanjay Turner of the Irish Guards.
Afghan officers I've worked with in the past have always had heart and always had courage, but their training courses have necessarily been truncated because the army's expanded so quickly. Officer cadets after a year on this course are really well prepared with just the most basic, simple life-saving drills, such as dominate a piece of high ground, don't allow yourself to be channeled, stop, listen before you enter a village, gain low-level intelligence. All these little things which we've seen them grasping now, which will save their lives.
Well, you talk about not dominating high ground. We're watching men going along a valley. They don't have anybody. They've got one guy on the high ground. No, that's not them. He's a forced close protection. And something's about to happen.
Well, they've gone firm. They're static. They've sat on the road.
Crouched down on the road.
Crouched down on the road.
Weapons pointing out.
They're appraising the ground ahead of them, so we'll see what happens. There is an ambush set for them on a rise up to their left. And so if they fail to dominate that piece of ground when they get ambushed, they'll learn that lesson.
Dushman, enemy, he calls into his radio as the ambush begins. The international community has paid billions to train and equip Afghanistan's armed forces, and NATO leaders will be asked to commit even more. But one day, Afghanistan will have to pay for all this alone. Can they afford the quality being delivered here? I asked the head of the British instructors at the Afghan Sandhurst, Brigadier Bruce Russell.
Can they afford not to do it? And I think the answer is to that is most certainly, no, they can't afford not to do it. They must do it. They absolutely must do it to make sure that we train the best possible young officers for the Afghan National Army. And that's what we're about at the moment. We're about professionalising the force. Having grown the force very quickly over the last 10 or so years, we are now taking stock and professionalising it.
Brigadier Russell's opposite number heading the academy is Afghan Brigadier General Sharif Sharifi.
So as you know, this academy is a model of Sandhurst Academy, and if you see the training, this is also a kind of the system of the Sandhurst Academy. So I would like to thank the British government for building this academy for Afghanistan.
Britain and a small group of other nations, including Australia and New Zealand, are committed to providing support for this training for some years to come. That's what gives it an assurance of quality.
I thought you all did very well today.
But with growing instability in Afghanistan and political paralysis as disputes over the presidential election almost enter a sixth month, that commitment cannot be taken for granted. With the world's attention diverted by Ukraine and the threat of the Islamic State, Afghanistan will struggle to compete for scarce resources.
Our correspondent David Loyne reporting. Well, that's just about it from us for now. An updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download in 12 hours. I'm Mark Coles. Until next time, goodbye.